Well, hello, thinkers. Welcome back to another podcast, and we're excited to have Dr. Scott Stripling from Associates for Biblical Research, and we are going to talk about something just amazing. In fact, it was worldwide news. It's the Mount Ebal Curse Tablet, and Scott has given us today and the next few episodes to be able to talk about it. Welcome, Scott.
Hey, Tim. Hi, Steve. It's good to be with you guys today.
And I forgot to introduce Steve Law, my writing partner and researcher. We worked together for many, many years, and we're going to basically talk today a little bit about this curse tablet. And for some people who don't really know what a curse tablet is, Scott, could you just give us a brief description of what it is and where it was found?
Well, this is very interesting. In the ancient world, execration texts, for example, out of Egypt are very, very early. They're curse texts. And then we get them written on metals, like lead becomes very common a little bit later. And many times they're petty sorts of curses, like from one individual toward another. They're thrown into tombs, wells, things like this, into the earth so that they go into the underworld. And it can be as petty as she stole my boyfriend, may her hair fall out, or something like that, to, very serious sorts of curses. We call them defixio or plural defixiones, and hundreds of these have been found in Israel from various time periods. And so it's a known quantity. Barbara Burrell, for example, at Caesarea Maritima on the coast, excavated, I think, between 70 and 80 of these in wells right there at Caesarea. And very interestingly, and she's published these as defixiones, very interestingly, she was told immediately that they were fishing weights and that she had it wrong. But Barbara pushed through and actually published it. It's a known quantity, so when we first saw it, I was shocked in that we were on the mountain of the cursing, the biblical mountain of the cursing, that we had a defixio, but I was not shocked and tried to figure out what it was.
Steve, could you just give a little context to this location? Mount Ebal is in the West Bank, as I understand it, and there's another mountain across from it, Gerizim. I've actually been there in the past filming. In fact, Adam Zertal he was an archaeologist who was surveying the area. These two mountains are very, very important because they're right next to Shechem, and in Shechem area, which is now called Nablus, I understand, there is the Joseph tomb, of which we talked about in our first film with the Exodus, Patterns of Evidence Exodus. So Steve, just biblically speaking, could you tell the audience, for those who might not understand the significance of this location where Scott and his team have found this curse tablet?
Right. Well, I think it goes back even further back to Abraham, where the first place he stopped when he came into the promised land of Canaan was at Shechem. And so it has a very long history. And we know Jacob came back there as well. And in Deuteronomy, Moses said that when you come back into the land, he instructed the Israelites after the Exodus from Egypt. He instructed them to go to Mount Gerizim and Ebal and to do this covenant renewal early on after they entered the land. So it has a strong significance. And of course, even in the days of Jesus, the woman at the well, I believe, was at Jacob's well there. And so it spans both testaments, and it's a very significant site.
For people who've not seen it, previously we did a 6-part series with Dr. Stripling and Dr. Peter Vanderveen on the Curse Tablet, and I'd recommend you watch that series as well. We recorded it, and those episodes, I think we'll put them up. We'll give you a link to that so you can see it. Scott, we're looking at our next Patterns of Evidence film. It's going to be about Israel and the covenant God made with them. Can you give a brief history of this covenant and the purpose behind the renewal at this location?
Well, this is where it gets very interesting. They're at Elam Moreh. So Elam Moreh is a stone's throw from Shechem, and that's where Abram cut covenant with God. And that is, the place of the Abrahamic covenant. So when Moses tells the Israelites, when you come into the land and you gain a foothold, Deuteronomy 27, then you're going to go to Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, pronounce blessings from Gerizim, curses from Ebal. He didn't have to tell them because that's where the Abrahamic covenant was cut. They already knew that. We as modern readers may have a problem of distanciation. So, it ties in really, really nicely there. And this idea that you have a greater party and a lesser party, you're coming into a binding agreement. And that's really what the tablet then also reflects, is when it's sealed, a binding agreement that it's self-imprecatory. These blessings will come upon us if we keep covenant. These curses will come upon us if we break covenant. And the New Testament, incidentally, the very first verse in Matthew 1:1, this is the story of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So Matthew immediately ties into the Davidic and Abrahamic covenants.
One thing that I've learned, and I never realized, and I like to just bring this up, is that God is a law-giving God. Now, oftentimes say Moses is the lawgiver. Well, the laws came from the Lord at Mount Sinai, and there are different laws. And what's interesting is that a covenant is a legal agreement. And Scott, I think what was interesting is that if you look at when they write the lineage of people, they're basically trying to go back and say there is a legal relationship between these people and these events. We know that scientists early on, many of them were people of faith, Isaac Newton, Galileo, and they knew that God was a law-giving God. So they thought, well, in his creation, he probably created physical laws, but there are also spiritual laws. The next movie is going to be on this covenant, and we're going to be looking for it in history. It's multiple films, and but it's fascinating because in many ways, there's many connections to this tablet that you found. This curse tablet is controversial because some people just, in some ways, don't believe any of this, and they really don't want to believe in any of it. But if we think about this altar, now Joshua built an altar on Mount Ebal. And can you give a brief review of the Israeli archaeologist Adam Zertal? Because, I think in the beginning he was I don't know if he was an agnostic or an atheist or what, but he was Jewish, but he didn't necessarily believe that any of this was true. So tell us a little bit about him.
So Adam grew up on a kibbutz, and the whole kibbutzim movement was very secular. So he was agnostic, had never read the Bible. He was a war hero and was wounded badly in the war, and later in his life walked on crutches. He was doing the Manasseh Hill Country Survey as a professor at the University of Haifa when he came across this site. It's called Site 276, or El Bernat A. It's on the second step on the backside of Mount Ebal. And he had never read the biblical text, if you can imagine. He started excavating in the early 80s, 1982. And by the second season, members of his team had begun to show him the biblical text. And once he saw it and he looked at what he was excavating, he said, this must be it. And he changed his mind. He said, I've been wrong. There is a historicity to the text. And so that became very problematic for his colleagues in academia. We can't just have secular professors going around talking about Bible and archaeology, but nonetheless, that's what they had. And over time, he exposed this 9 by 7 meter rectangular altar, oriented, by the way, at the 4 compass points. And at the perfect geometric center of it, underneath it, was a round altar, smaller round altar that was 2 by 2 meters, that he believed was the original, what he called primogenial cultic site at Mount Ebal. Joshua 8:30 says that Joshua built an altar to the Lord on Mount Ebal, and that the Lord told him to write there and to pronounce curses there. So here you have not only Mount Gerizim identified and Mount Ebal identified, but then we get an altar on the place where God told Joshua to build an altar, and the lower one, the original one, it appears that the secondary one from the period of the Judges was built on top of the earlier one to protect it, to venerate it. It appeared to Adam and to me that the lower round altar was indeed the altar of none other than Joshua ben Nun.
Interesting when you think about the thing that impressed me about Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal is that they're almost like a football stadium. And what the Bible says is that the Israelites, 6 tribes were on one side, and they shouted out to the other side the blessings, and the other group shouted the curses. And I think Mount Ebal, was that on the curse side? I was on the blessing side, so I'm glad I was on that side.
But I want you to think about it. Maybe not. Maybe the inverse is true. because the altar is built on the mountain of the curse. We don't need an altar. What is an altar for? Leviticus 17:11, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. And with that altar on Mount Ebal, this gives them a means. In other words, we don't need an altar on Mount Gerizim. When everything's going right in my life and all the blessings are flowing and I'm walking in obedience, I don't need that. It's when I fail, it's when I sin, when I fracture my relationship with God and others that I need an altar. And it's through the shedding of blood that we have forgiveness of sin. I mean, I have just a few feet from me here, bones from Shiloh, from the 5 Isa there, from the sacrificial system, literally animals whose blood was shed to cover men's sins. As of course, as a Christian, I believe this was a type of the blood of Christ that would later be shed to take away our sins.
There's so much that's unfolding here. The thing that I find interesting, obviously, is something that Adam Zertal said. He said that all we need now is an inscription. And he said that prophetically in some ways, if you believe that there could be one found. The challenge with the Mount Ebal area is that it's on the West Bank, which is difficult, to do because of, the archaeology of the land. Any type of sort of reinforcement that there was a Israelite history to that land is going to be challenged, right?
Right. It's difficult, and not only is it in the West Bank, Tim, but it's Area B within the West Bank. So A is under Palestinian control, C is under Israeli control, B is divided. So it's Palestinian civil control, Israeli military control. So it's the disputed territory within the disputed territory. And so it's super problematic.
When we think about this inscription, we could just talk a little bit about how you came about uncovering this material that you could find and this idea that you've been working with, which is called sifting, right?
So, to go back to your prior question, Adam did say that all we needed was an inscription. And I think that posthumously he has been vindicated, because he took a lot of heat, believe me, when he came out and said this is a cultic site, it's an altar on Mount Ebal, it's probably Joshua's altar. He was lambasted. I mean, they went after him. I mean, this is a contact sport, archaeology. And Agatha Christie, was married to a famous archaeologist, and she once laughed about blood on the carpet in the field. I mean, he really took it. It can't possibly be. It's a watchtower. It's all kinds of different things. Interestingly, over time, the pendulum has swung, and most scholars do accept this as a cultic site, and many as Joshua's altar. So very interesting. Now, how did we come about finding this? Through our new technology of wet sifting. I worked for 2 years as a supervisor with Gabi Barkai and Zaki Devira on the Temple Mount sifting project in Jerusalem years ago. And this is where I became a believer in the potential of wet sifting, because I saw what happened when, after we dry sifted material, and normally it gets thrown away, when we washed it, we found out we were missing a whole lot of things. Coins and bula and scarabs and things like this were being tossed. At that point, I made up my mind, one of these days when I'm in charge and have the opportunity to do this in the field, in situ, then we're going to do wholesale wet sifting, because I saw the potential. Once these things are out of context, they have far less value to us. What I wanted to do in December of 2019 was to wet sift 2 dump piles from the 1980s, one at Shiloh, one at Mount Ebal, and publish a boring methodological paper to my academic colleagues saying, look, here's what you published at Shiloh. In this case, Israel Finkelstein. Here's what you published at Shiloh. Here's what we found at the dump pile. You published 4 scarabs. We found 16 in your dump pile. So for every one you published, there were 4 that you missed. Not to throw stones at him, but just to say methodologically, there's a better way. I thought we're probably going to find the same thing at Mount Ebal. We're going to find many, many things that they had missed. And indeed, that's what happened. I didn't go there looking for anything.
It's got dirt wrapped around it, I mean, if anyone has a vegetable garden and you pull a carrot out, you wouldn't want to just take a bite out of that carrot, right? or because it's got stuff clung to it. So it's very, very hard to identify, anything, right? So in some ways, there's an absolute genius to wet sifting, because it takes all the ancillary material that would cause your ability to see a coin or an inscription, or let's say a curse tablet. It would help to clear up the ability to find something. So I'm just wanted to say that, because most people don't quite maybe know what it looks like when they're doing this.
It takes time and money. And so for this reason, many of my colleagues have resisted this. Our current methodology is working fine. All I wanted to demonstrate was that, hey, I have found a better way. It's like I found a cure to a disease. Let me show you what it is. But many of them are embracing this. And even the Antiquities Authority are sending people to our site to be trained in this. We're building wet sifting stations for other digs. We're funny creatures, aren't we? We cry out for change, and then we resist it with all our might. And so here we have a better methodology, and that's, again, the original goal of the project was to just simply say, we've all got to start wet sifting. If you don't know how to do it, we'll help you do it. We'll teach you how to do it. Along the way, we uncovered this defixio, which became this great big story.
It was a worldwide news story, because this really connects the Bible. It connects Hebrew. It connects the alphabet. I've got the Moses controversy back here. Did Moses write? What did he have the ability to write? Could Joshua have written? Was this language viable? Well, there's so many things that are connected. And Scott, when we think about the Gospel of John, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the word is so important. We realize today in our culture, people are taking words, they're twisting meanings of words, they're coming up with new words to sort of marginalize people. Words are really important, and words are important to the Lord. And Scott, let's just explain or describe the day it was found. What happened exactly?
With the help of Aaron Lipkin, we had located or relocated some of Adam Zertal's dump piles, his discarded material from the 1980s, in his east and west dump. And we kept track of which was from which dump, because the east material is what had come out of the altar, according to Zertal. So we had relocated that material, Midrishet Shomron, at a place called Shave Shomron. And a building had burned down, and we were able to clear the material and get down to the slab, and it was a perfect spot for our winter project. What we did is we systematically then went through that material. We dry sifted it, as Zertal had done, and we got some things out of the dry sifting. Then we put it in bags, soaked the bags, and then we washed that. We built a provisional wet sifting station where we could have water pressure to wash the material, and then our volunteers, staff and volunteers, then would work through that. And of course, we began to find things. We found tools and styluses and blades and flints, 300 pieces of diagnostic pottery that they had missed, even some that was incised and important. But the day that we found the defixio, fortuitously, it was in the tray of Frankie Snyder, who was my most experienced staff member with wet sifting. She'd worked for over a decade as a staff member on the Temple Mount Sifting Project. And so fortuitously, it was in Frankie's tray, and we missed it in dry sifting, just like Zertal had missed it. So this small, lead tablet covered in dirt looked like a stone chip. And so the people who dry sifted saw it, just moved it aside, because they're seeing so many in the course of the day. But when it was washed, then it popped out. Frankie spotted it, and she said those famous words to me, "Scott, you better come see this." And that's usually really bad or really good. And so I went over, took Abigail with me, and then we just sat there, the three of us, and looked at each other like, you've got to be kidding me. We all immediately knew what it was. It was the defixio. And we thought, wow. And then I immediately warned them. I said, it's a curse tablet, and that's big news. It's from the Mountain of the Curse. But I only know of these in later time periods, like Persian, Hellenistic, Roman period. So, someone could have come along later and thought it was Joshua's altar and left a curse there. So don't get your hopes up too high. It is a big deal, but we don't know that this is from the time of Joshua. But while I'm telling them that, out of the other side of my brain, I'm thinking, but wait a minute, 99.9% of our pottery is from this earlier time period. So how would this happen? So I was just more shocked than anyone when we were using the tomographic technology, able to see on the inside, and it turned out that it was a very ancient script.
It would be nice to get an overview of the type of script that you find there. Where do you see that elsewhere, and what is its development? I know we've done a film on the Moses controversy about the initial development of the alphabet coming out of Egypt and out of the Sinai and then spreading to Canaan. How does this script fall into that sequence?
Interestingly, when I was in school, we were still being taught that the alphabet came from Phoenicia, from Mesopotamia, and now we know that simply is not the case, that it was coming from Egypt. You have these Egyptian hieroglyphs, say Middle Egyptian, hundreds of characters in Middle Egyptian, and I assume Moses was fluent in Middle Egyptian, and they're beginning to morph into phonetic letters. And we see them in the Sinai in lots of places. The mines at Sedabet El Harim, I think you've probably filmed there, the Wadi al Nazb and other places. We call these normally a Proto-Sinaitic script or a Proto-Canaanite script, or as I like better, a Proto-Alphabetic script, because we don't know that it's pertaining to one certain group unless there's verbiage within it that is unique to that culture, because it was a shared alphabet. So we saw this very, very ancient script where we have, for example, a man with his arms raised in worship. That's a che, what becomes the Hebrew che, like in hallelujah, or an ox head, which everyone agrees is morphing into an aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So when we begin to see these things, we said it's that script, and that's 13th, 14th, 15th century BC. That's older than any writing we have in Israel, and that's when it got really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. In the Moses controversy, what I uncovered was that there were a number of scholars who were raised in biblical backgrounds. Their families were Christians. They were raised in a Christian background, but they went off to college and they lost their faith because they were told that there's no evidence. I was in the same place, by the way, because when I went on this investigation way back in 2002 and came back from talking with Manfred Vitek, and I had a crisis of faith. As many people know, I've shared this. And I've seen where a crisis of faith can lead people. There's a crisis of faith or there's a confirming of faith. And I think the thing that's been wonderful about this curse tablet is that it confirms, I think, that there was something earlier, and it starts to unfold that God is communicating. He wants to have a relationship with us, and he's communicating that there are blessings if you follow him, and there are curses if you disobey him. And that's what the Jewish people we're dealing with. And Steve and I right now are looking at this historically, and we're looking at these covenants. This location is so significant because Abraham came there, Jacob came there, Joseph was buried in this area, Joshua came back to this area. We're talking about a hot spot, a place where a lot of biblical activity happened. And now we found, you have found this inscription. Steve, do you have anything to add to that?
I would say that this curse tablet also speaks to the idea of literacy. Not just that could Moses write, but could anybody read what he wrote? Could they write the law on their doorposts as they were instructed, and so forth. And so I would like to hear a little bit more about how you established the date of these altars and of the curse tablet. Was there more than one factor involved, and so forth? How did you arrive at the date that you think this tablet comes from?
Well, let me answer it two different ways. First of all, the stakes are high because we've had several generations of seminaries who have taught their students, these are future leaders, that there was no literacy in early Israel and that Moses and Joshua could not have written. This is all based on what we call the documentary hypothesis, that 1,000 years later, either in the Persian period or the Hellenistic period, the text was redacted, and so we have no eyewitnesses. And so you've got 3 generations now of pastors, thought leaders, who even if they didn't completely buy into it, those ideas were sewed into their minds. And now we have direct evidence of literacy in early Israel that even includes the name Yahweh, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later. But specifically to your question, Steve, we dated this using 3 methods. Number 1 was the archaeological context. So Zertal excavated there were only 2 strata. There was a late Bronze Age 2 and there was an Iron Age 1. And so, we knew we were in that horizon. Zertal dated his late Bronze 2 stratum to about 1250. I think it probably goes back a little earlier than that, but regardless, we're comfortable saying that it's late Bronze 2. So that was the archaeological context. Number 2, the lead. We were able to test the lead, and it proved that this was a test at Hebrew University. It showed us that a mine in Lavrion, Greece is where the lead came from. Now, very interesting. This mine is in use. It's a massive mine, by the way. It was in use in many time periods, late Bronze Age and also later on into the Iron Age. But here's where it's interesting. In Iron Age 1, exports from the Aegean into Canaan, Israel, Canaan, ceased or came to a trickle, and all archaeologists agree upon that. And the source of lead that was used in the Iron Age, as Aaron Mayer and Chris Rolston in their article attempting to critique what we had written, they actually help us make this point that in Iron Age 1, they are not using lead from Lavrion. So if the lead came from Lavrion, and in Iron Age 1 in Israel and Canaan, they're not using lead from Lavrion, then it suggests that it could likely be a late Bronze Age 2 date.
Because I'm thinking this through, historically, couldn't have come from that later period because they weren't using it.
They did come back to the mines in Lavrion, but in Iron Age 1, they didn't. So then this suggested to us of the 2 possibilities, late Bronze Age 2 and Iron Age 1, it must be late Bronze Age 2.
Scott, what was used to determine that late Bronze 2 or Iron 1? What was the initial evidence?
Pottery, scarabs, things of this nature. I think, there's pretty general agreement on that dating. The third way we dated was with the paleography of the letters. So the style of those letters, the ched that I described, the style of the aleph, the ox head morphing and so forth, that style best fits in the late Bronze Age 2 and even in late Bronze Age 1. So those 3 things, the style of the letters, the paleography, the archaeological context, and the source of the lead together strongly suggested that we had a late Bronze Age 2 artifact.
That's fantastic to kind of see that connection, but it's not so fantastic if you don't want it to be there, right?
Right. Well, remember, Jesus said, even if one would rise from the dead, they would not believe. I mean, if someone has already made up his mind, like some scholars, before we even published our Heritage Science article, had already come out and said, it can't possibly be. So let's not bother reading the evidence. It just can't possibly be. So there's this line of reasoning that goes something like this. It is so because I say it is so. And that's not very good science.
Well, what's funny about that is that let's just take the Exodus. People would say this about the Exodus. The Exodus that didn't happen had to have happened around 1250 BC. The Exodus that didn't happen had to have happened around 1250 BC. So, I mean, when you ask the question, Steve and I, when we were trying to figure this thing out with the Exodus film, I mean, honestly, there was 12 years of trying to, become familiar with what the arguments would be. And eventually, that's when the whole issue of pattern of evidence came into being, was that we just said, listen, I mean, you have schools of thought where people have been, like you just mentioned, that they have been told about the documentary hypothesis. And I went and spoke with Israel Finkelstein. Basically, the Bible was written after, I think, Babylon, to give a history to the Jewish people. That's what he was saying, is that this was invented so that people would have authority or power over people, and said, hey, listen, you better listen to us, the priests and the authorities, or else God's going to punish you.
And we got, the same sort of thing from the IEJ article that Aaron Mayer and Chris Rolston wrote. They say Stripling and Vanderveen have in the past published their views that there was an exodus or conquest around 1400 BC, and they must be trying to prove it. The reason they dated this the way they did is they wanted to prove their preconceived idea. Now, isn't that just a hilarious ad hominem attack? In his rejection of that date, I could just as easily turn around and say he's rejecting it on the basis of trying to confirm his preconceived idea that this exodus or conquest happened in the 13th century.
Right. Later on, I went back and met with Manfred Bitek. And met him in Jerusalem. And, I was nervous about that, but he wanted to talk about this. He shared that we shouldn't dismiss. He saw connections with Hebrew words in the Egyptian, documents. The challenge is, and I was told this by Yuri Zarins, he says that, just so I want everyone to realize how this is. I mean, I don't think you'd be surprised anymore, but institutions of higher learning have a sort of a line that people need to walk. But Yuri told me this. He said, Tim, in an interview, he said, there are archaeologists all the time that find evidence for biblical things, biblical events, and they go, yeah, but I can't write about that, or I can't see this, I can't do that. He says, I'm retiring. I don't care anymore. I'm not worried about losing my job now. I think, you get into a way of thinking and you continue to try to defend that. And I actually was with a man who said that, scholars will defend their position once they make it to the bitter end. They're just not going to change. And it was really disappointing to me, because I was hoping that somebody would basically say, oh, I'm open to information. I'm open. And the sad part is the cement hardens after a while. And it's not going to, basically, that ability to be open-minded. I've had to basically do this. Steve and I have, we're filmmakers. We're just saying, okay, I'm going to act as if I'm, in a sense, agnostic, which means I have lots of questions. And then I'm going to look for a pattern and everything. So when we come back, we're going to come back to another episode. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Scott and Steve. We're going to come back in the next episode. And what are we going to talk about, Scott?
Well, I'd like to get into some of the controversy. Since we have published this article, what has the response been, and what do I have to say about that?
Absolutely. So hang on, everyone. We'll be back in the next episode with more about the Mount Ebal Curse inscription.